Listeners, imagine you've been writing for years. You have enough material for a book, but every time you sit down to write the story at the center of it all, you find yourself circling and maybe even freezing. You get close, but you never quite land on it. Sound familiar? On this week's episode of the Writing Resilience podcast, I'm joined by Meagan Justus, a writer and advocate who explores the messy middle of chronic illness, disability, and trauma by blending honesty and humor in a way that will make you laugh and drop your jaw at the same time. In this Ask Me Anything session, Meagan brings two questions that so many writers quietly wrestle with. First, when you keep circling the core of your story without being able to reach it, should you shape what you have or keep writing until you get there? And second, when your story involves people or institutions with power, how do you protect yourself while still telling the truth? Together, we dig into why writers circle their stories, how changing names doesn't protect you legally, what the vetting process actually looks like, and what the unfolding controversy around Amy Griffin's memoir, The Tell, can teach us all about the writing process. Let's dive in. Welcome to Writing Resilience, the podcast for writers who want to write and live the story that sets them free. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison, a writer, transformational and trauma-informed coach, story alchemist, and fellow traveler on the winding road of healing and creativity. Each week, I'll share tools, practices, and conversations that will help you let go of what no longer serves you as you create stories that change lives, especially your own. Together, we'll explore how to trust your creative voice, support your mental health and resilience, work with your nervous system and unique design, and stay connected to your deepest calling as a writer, even when life gets messy. It's time, my friends, to write and live the story that sets you free. I'm honored to walk that journey alongside you, one story and one episode at a time. Listeners, I have to pause for a second because there's something I really want you to know. So many memoirists I have worked with have had the same experience. They've written what feels like a book, but their manuscript is overloaded. Like the story is buried somewhere inside that material and they can't find it. Structure is what helps you see what belongs and what's pulling your story off course. In my April 29th webinar with Jane Friedman, Find and Refine Your Memoir's Narrative Arc, we'll work through 3 powerful structural models that will help you identify your turning points, cut what doesn't serve the story, and shape your material into a focused, compelling book. The link to register is in the show notes. I'd love to work with you. Well, hello, Meagan. Welcome to the Writing and Resilience podcast. I'm so happy to have you on.
I'm excited to be here. Very much looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, you have 2 really important questions that I know are on people's minds, and I'm really excited to dive into them. And I just want to say I'm excited to be here with you because I am a fan of your writing, and because you are in one of my writing groups, I get the pleasure of hearing your writing all the time. You also have an amazing Substack, which listeners, you need to subscribe to. But that's just my opinion. I always start by giving the guest a chance to share a little about themselves. And what would you like us to know about you?
Well, I'm a writer living in Virginia, and I am an advocate exploring the messy middle of chronic illness, disability, and trauma. And I try to blend honesty and humor in my writing.
And I'm going to say you don't just try, you deliver. Because I've
Thank
had
you.
a chance to hear it. And I love that you're able to blend these 2 things together because, the chronic illness space, and just in terms of the experience, can be really dark. And I say that as someone who has lived with chronic illness, has experienced that. Yeah, you have a way of making these really pithy, important points while also making them a little funny.
Thank you. I try. Well, as you said, you see it, so I do.
You do. You definitely do. Well, this is one of my Ask Me Anything sessions. And so this is an opportunity for writers who are in the middle of the process to ask a question about something that's on their mind related to the writing process. What question would you like to start with?
I have a number of essays that I'm working towards a memoir and essay. And I feel like I have enough to make a book potentially, but I also feel like I keep circling the core of my story and not really being able to get to the middle of that and writing it. So I'm trying to figure out, do I stop and just try to pull the themes of what I already have and make a book with what I already have? Or do I just keep writing until I get all of it down and get to that core content?
That's a great question, and there can be many answers. But I want to explore one, why do we circle around our stories? And then what can we do to get out of that experience of trying to revise or write into infinity, right? Because I know a lot of writers who can get trapped in that, where a project is taking 15, 20 years. They have hundreds of thousands of words they've written, and they don't feel any closer to the end than they were when they began. So let me unpack, why do we circle around the core of our stories? Sometimes we circle around it because we don't actually know what the story is. And I know that's not the case for you, but for some people, it's like, I know all of these experiences are important to me. They bring me joy, or they connect me to a pain that I haven't yet processed. And yet I don't know how they go together. And if that's the case, one of the ways that you can handle that is by putting everything together and seeing them in line to see how they might go together. And a couple ways you can do that is, this is something that the guys from South Park use. It's the but therefore principle. And so that's a way to create cause and effect. And as you do that, you're constantly asking yourself the question, how have I changed? Right? How am I different? And sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to share some sort of extremely dramatic change, and that may not be the case. Sometimes the changes that we experience are pretty simple and understated, and yet change still occurs. So that's one way to do that. And you can augment that process with a beat sheet. You can look at the Queen's Path. There are a lot of different ways to do that. And if you're interested in learning how to do that, you can take Find and Refine Your Memoir's Narrative Arc on April 29th, which is a webinar that I'm teaching for Jane Friedman. So if that's the reason you're circling around your story, those are some different strategies that you can use. However, if you're circling around your story because there's a pain point that is difficult to dive into, then the strategies you're going to use will be different, right? And so there are a couple of ways that you can handle it. Sometimes when we have a really difficult thing that has happened to us, we've had a really difficult experience, we need time to be able to get to it. And some writers will look at the same experience in different ways over time in different projects. So that's one opportunity. And I'll give you two examples of memoirists who've done this. So Nick Flynn, he wrote Another Bullshit Night in Suck City. And this is a memoir about finding his father. But one of the big things that he talks about is his mother's suicide. He had also written about that in a much shorter, more compressed way in his poetry collection, Some Ether. He brings that back in other books that he wrote, such as A Ticking is the Bomb, right? So there's ways that he explored that over time. Mary Karr is another author that did that. One of the primary issues of her life is that her mother tried to kill her when she was young during a psychotic episode. Well, in The Liars Club, she talks about that, but she doesn't get too deep into the experience. And really, the focus of that book is how secrets can destroy families. Because the big secret that led to that psychotic episode is she lost her kids before Mary was even born. She had another set of children. She lost custody of them. And it's hard to say if she lost custody of them due to her mental health challenges or if that exacerbated her mental health challenges. I don't know enough about that part of the story. But in the very final chapter of the book, we learn about that experience and how it impacted her, right? So that's one way that she talks about it. And she kind of glances by that experience of almost being killed by her mom. She returns to that experience in Cherry, talks about it a little bit, but that's more of a coming of age, growing into yourself, understanding your identity book. And then in Lit, which is the book where she confronts her alcoholism and regains her religion and her sense of spirituality, she talks about that in greater detail. So sometimes we need multiple projects to get to something. And what I love about thinking about it in that way is that it gives you license to take your time. It takes the pressure away. And sometimes if you're like, I need to say it in this book and I only want to have one book, I'm not doing this a bunch of times, then it may be about how you take care of yourself in the writing process. So as you think about your project and what I've just shared, what's coming to mind?
Patience with myself. And I think for me, there is reason for fear. I realize that probably, yes, I know I'm circling around the core content, and maybe it's not putting that pressure on myself. I am getting to it. I get the visual of like a little funnel cloud where you're starting up here. You know, you need to get to the bottom, but you're just going to have to take some time to write essays that touch on it. And then that maybe the next one goes a different angle or a little deeper until I can really get to it.
Yes. And, I love that you created that really beautiful metaphor of that funnel cloud. And what we want to make sure that we don't do, so there's the funnel cloud that may be on land, but if we think about it in terms of a whirlpool, right, that's in the water, we do not want to get sucked down to the bottom. And then we're in a space where we can drown in our own experience and our own material. So being able to tread water and tread around it in a way that feels safe is really important. And I have the benefit of knowing more about your topics, the things that you write about. And it could be as a way to really claim your voice and glance against that experience. You could write about one of the ancillary topics, right? So there's a core topic that I know you're trying to dive deeply into, but there's other topics or other ways that you could explore this. So for instance, you could write a book that shares something just about, say, chronic illness, which is one of your topics that you do write about. And you write a book about chronic illness, just that. And maybe you're glance against some of these other things that I know you want to write about, but that might give you a chance to claim your voice, develop all of the skills to go from the beginning of a project to the end of a project, and get something done that feels satisfying and gives you a sense of success. And then when you understand what that whole process is like and you've shared that, you're going to take all of the wisdom from working on that book and you can apply it to the next layer of the experiences that you want to explore. What do you think about that?
That definitely feels right. And I think in the beginning, I was sort of not against writing a chronic illness book per se, but there's just so many out there. And I'm like, what added thing can I put in that space? But I actually do think I do have a lot to add. But I think you're right. Like being able to touch on some of those topics that are maybe even if they're more current day, but then later on, I'm still writing, I'm still circling, but I have content that could be used in that way. So yeah, I think that fits really well.
Yeah. And what I would say is that you do have something new to say about chronic illness because you have this way of getting to the point. And I'll just say, as a person who has dealt with chronic illness and is kind of dealing with it right now, you make me feel seen. You make me feel seen, Meagan, in a way that I haven't yet experienced. And I think that's the power of your work. And you make me laugh while you do it. Where there is this moment where I'm like, damn, microphone drop. That is so true. And yet I'm also laughing, right? So there's that mixture of the honesty and the pain and the struggle alongside some of the funnier elements and the ridiculousness that we confront. Yeah, so you have a strategy now. You can work on arranging the material that you already have into a book on chronic illness and go through that process. But you came with another question, and it may be a question that's related to this new project that you're going to work on, or it could be related to something else. What is that?
It was when grappling with a story that implicates people of power or institutions, and you have that sort of the push-pull of the fear of talking and then wanting to also get your story out on paper. Yeah, just how to navigate that push-pull between write and don't speak.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because so many memoirists, especially those who have experienced trauma, have felt silenced for most of their lives, or they felt like their experience is irrelevant in some way. And so being able to write is a form of claiming their power. And that is a very important thing to do. And I think you can write about anything for yourself or for a very small group of people, like your trusted people in your writing community, as a way of claiming power. But then when you think about, okay, what do I share with the public? It can be tricky because I want to tell you, you can write whatever you want and you can own your truth and nothing is ever going to happen to you. And if I said that, not only would it be irresponsible, it would be a lie. Because, when it comes to getting sued, right? That's what we're going to talk about now. It's like, how do you protect yourself from getting sued or repercussions of any sort when it comes to writing about or writing against power? Right, in all the forms that it can take place, is that number one, I want to just say from the outset, I am not a lawyer. If you have deep questions about your book, I'm going to direct you to two places. One is the Authors Guild, because if you are a member of the Authors Guild, they can help you get in touch with an entertainment lawyer and you get some benefits around that. So number one, if you have these concerns, that's the first thing I would do. And always consult with an entertainment lawyer if you have questions beyond what the Authors Guild can provide for you. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. Don't just listen to what I have to say. And I'll be very careful in how I talk about it because I don't want to get in trouble for anything that I say and I don't want to get it wrong. So again, always consult a lawyer. But when it comes to getting sued, really anyone could sue you at any time if they wanted to. The people who are most likely to sue are people who have resources. It's not a guarantee that that's the only one who could, but people who have resources, meaning money to sue you or to try to get your project shut down, those are the people who are going to do that. And so if someone has power in any shape or form, it's likelihood that that's the case. And so what you would want to do is really understand libel and defamation of character. You want to understand what those things are, because this is a question that I get all the time. And that's, well, can I just change the names and maybe change the description? And isn't that enough? And it's not. And here's the reason why. A general reader who knows nothing about you is not going to question that for the most part. Though I'm going to share a story about how that is not always the case. But a general reader who has no experience of you is not going to wonder who your husband Bob is, right? Let's just say you have a husband Bob and that's who you're writing about. They're not going to guess who Bob really is. But if someone knew you during that period of time when you're writing about, they're going to know who Bob is, okay? No matter what color hair he has, no matter what name he has, no matter how tall or short you make him, they're going to know. And because that's the case, simply changing names and details is not enough. And if you're writing against power or you're speaking against power, it's really important to have proof. And so I had a client who did this and did it fearlessly. And this person had diary entries. They had books that had information in it. They had all of this information and they went through legal vetting at the publishing house, right? So the publisher put her in touch with a lawyer, and then this author had to provide all of this information. And it was a grueling process. It took days, and they had to just keep showing more documentation. And anything that they couldn't document had to be stricken from the manuscript. And so there are different ways that a lawyer might suggest you strike something from a manuscript. It could be that they say, take it out, period, because the risk of being sued is too high. And only a lawyer can tell you what that is. But they may also say, well, instead of saying it in this way, and I think this is more often what happens, they might say, adjust the language in this way. Use this word versus this other word that you've chosen. Phrase your sentence in that way. And the legal vetting process can do that. And I will put in the show notes a link to an Authors Guild webinar on legal vetting that can teach you more about that. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely do that. And I would say if you are working with a small publisher or you are self-publishing your book and you know that you're speaking against power or you're saying things that could potentially put you at risk for being sued, going through that legal vetting process, even if it's just a small chunk of your manuscript, pay for that, it could help you out in so many ways. And I have talked to a number of people who actually were very successful. And I can think of one example in particular. This person self-published. They thought they did everything right. And then something happened later on. And then they had a legal entanglement that they had to deal with. Had they gone through legal vetting, that may not have happened. And it was resolved fine. And it's not an issue for that person, but it was pretty stressful for a period of time. And they almost had to take their book off the market because of this situation and entanglement. So legal vetting is something that you definitely want to look into. to if you are considering that. And the other thing I'll say is that you can't necessarily count on your publisher to do that. And that's where I'm going to talk about Amy Griffin's memoir, The Tell. So I will put a gift link in the show notes that includes an article from the New York Times where they did an extensive investigation into this book. So if you want to read more about it, you can. But a lawsuit is coming out from that book. So I'm just going to give you the gist so you understand. So Amy Griffin is someone who has a lot of money, and she wrote a memoir about how she recovered a memory of severe sexual abuse during a psychedelic experience. And so she writes about this experience that she recovered. So that's what this memoir is about. And it includes some really vivid and graphic depictions of sexual assault in this book. Because probably she has a lot of money, or maybe she just knows how to get connections, she was connected to some very powerful people. Gwyneth Paltrow, Oprah, I could probably name a few more. And all of these people endorsed her book, which meant a few different things. One, because she had those connections prior to getting her book deal, she got a really big book deal, right? Hundreds of thousands of dollars that she was paid for this book. She did work with a ghostwriter who helped her with the writing, but she got this big deal. And then all of these people who are famous and well-known promoted the book, which meant lots and lots of copies sold. But as the New York Times began to investigate this book, there were some holes in the story that didn't make sense. And also, she accused a teacher at the school she was at of just horrific sexual abuse. And this is where I'm getting to that point of like, you can't just change the names. She changed the names and possibly some descriptions of this person. But the students at that school at that time put two and two together and figured out who that teacher was. So then that person was outed. So that's a whole issue. And the one thing I'll say about that, and this is a story that is unfolding. I am talking about the story at a specific point in time. So could the information about the story change? Yes. So this is what I'm telling you based on what is out there now. The New York Times did an investigation, and they were looking for other victims of this teacher who could corroborate what had happened. And no other victims came forward, which they found to be unusual because typically when there are these really horrific cases of abuse, more people come up, right? So there's more victims that raise their hand and say, hey, I was harmed too. That never happened. Does that alone mean that her story is false? No, it doesn't, but it was a red flag. Another red flag that came up is that her story of abuse was very similar to abuse that had happened to a character that is named in the book, who happened to be, I believe, in the foster care system. And this was someone who did not have a lot of power, right? And so that person was abused by someone else, not this teacher, but someone else within the school system. And it's possible that Amy used her story as her own, right? It's possible. And actually, there's a lawsuit around it. So what the outcome of that lawsuit is, we don't know, but it is in process right now. So here's the thing I want you to know. How did that happen? How did this book get published and get past the publisher's team and out there, right? Who was fact checking this book? The answer is no one. In many cases, when it comes to memoir, there can even be clauses in the contract that say that, you are testifying that you will hold harmless the publisher, that you attest that this information is correct. And so, what's going to happen with this? I believe the lawsuit is against the publisher, the ghostwriter, and Amy, the author. And again, we don't know where that's going to go, but I think it's just a great example of why it's so important for authors to pay attention to what they're writing and making sure that they are legally vetting their work, especially if they're speaking against power or if they're saying things that could cause real harm to another person. And that doesn't mean that you have to shy away from bad things that have happened and shove them under the rug. I'm not suggesting that. But if you want to protect yourself, make sure you can verify things.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Well, I know I shared a whole bunch there. Is that bringing up anything to mind for you?
No, other than just dotting the I's, crossing the T's if I were to go forward with writing certain content.
Yeah. And what I would say is, and this is true for all listeners, if you have a story on your heart and it's really important for you to own your truth and own your power, write it for yourself. Don't silence yourself based on anything that I've said. However, if you are sharing this for a wider audience, if you are sharing this with the public, you owe it to yourself and to your story to make sure that you are doing exactly what you said, Meagan, which is dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and double checking every single one of your facts and considering legal vetting, whether your publisher offers it to you or not.
That's really helpful.
Well, as we wrap up today, I'm just going to ask you one more question, and that is, how do you tap into your resilience as you are working on your stories?
Ooh, well, I'm always looking for the humor, even in the hardest things, and just reminding myself I've already survived so much. So the hardest part is over.
I love that. Amazing self-talk, finding the humor. And this is something that I'm going to say because, again, I've had the chance to read your work. You're a master of the hermit crab form. You have this beautiful way of taking a story and putting it in another form. And if you're listening to this and you're like, hermit crab, what are you talking about? I will put a link in the show notes so you can learn more about that. Well, Meagan, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you and to have the opportunity to explore these wonderful questions with you.
Thanks for having me. It was really helpful.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Meagan and sign up for her Substack, please see the show notes for this episode. And if you'd like to take this conversation a little deeper, grab your notebook and then try one of these writing prompts. Why am I circling the story? Is it because I don't yet know what it is? Or because it's too painful to approach? What would it look like to tread water safely around this material rather than avoiding it entirely? And how could I tell this story in multiple projects so I can give myself permission to tackle it slowly as I also complete some of my writing projects? You can make my day by sharing your answer in the comments on YouTube, along with any questions you'd like me to answer. I'd love to hear from you. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways that you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review so others can find the show. 3, join my engaged dynamic community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Ditch Your Inner Critic, 5 tools to transform self-doubt into self-support. Until next time, remember that your story matters. As you write and connect with the truest, most authentic version, you become not just the writer, but the person you're meant to be. And that, my friends, is the real freedom writing can offer.